The smoke from the hearth fire curled lazily upward, filling the cramped one-room cottage with a familiar haze that stung the eyes but kept the worst of the winter's chill at bay. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls, a constant companion to the simple family huddled around the central fire pit. This was life in medieval Europe, not the glamorous castles and knights of romantic tales, but the everyday reality of the vast majority who tilled the soil, served their lords, and prayed to survive another season. Hello, before you settle in, I'd truly appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with what I'm sharing here. It means so much to me. Also, please share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always touched to see how we're all coming together from across the globe. Now let's create a calm space, lower the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for a gentle hum, and let's begin this journey together. I want to take you back to a time that feels impossibly distant from our modern comforts, yet connected to us through the unbroken thread of human experience. Tonight we'll walk alongside the forgotten people of history, the medieval peasants who made up roughly 90% of Europe's population between the 10th and 15th centuries. These weren't the kings, queens, knights or clergy who dominate our history books. These were the people who fed everyone else through their daily labour, whose calloused hands and weather-beaten faces told stories that rarely made it into the chronicles of their time. The medieval landscape imagine waking up each morning not to an alarm clock, but to the roosters crowing as the first light breaks over the horizon. Your home isn't a separate bedroom in a spacious house, but a small corner of a single-room dwelling shared with your entire family and, during colder months, perhaps even your animals. The floor beneath your feet isn't hardwood or carpet, but packed earth covered with rushes or straw that you change out occasionally when the smell becomes too overwhelming. This modest home sits within a village of perhaps 100 to 300 people, surrounded by open fields divided into strips. In most of medieval Europe, these fields were farmed in what historians call the open field system, where each family worked several scattered strips rather than a single, consolidated plot. This wasn't inefficiency, but insurance. If blight affected one area or weather damaged certain parts of the field, no single family would bear the entire burden of crop failure. The village itself wasn't randomly arranged, but carefully situated near essential resources: water, wood, and workable land. Most medieval villages grew organically over time rather than being planned, with homes clustered along dirt paths that widened in places to form common areas. At the centre might stand a simple church, often the only stone building in the village, serving as both religious centre and community gathering place. Beyond the village and its cultivated fields lay what medieval people called the waste, uncultivated lands that provided vital resources. Here grew wild fruits and nuts for gathering, medicinal herbs for healing, and grazing land for animals. The nearby forest, if there was one, supplied wood for building and fuel, game for hunting, though often restricted by the Lord's forest laws, and forage for pigs. The medieval landscape was far from the untouched wilderness we might imagine. By the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300 CE, much of Europe's forests had already been cleared for agriculture. The land was a patchwork of human influence: villages, fields, managed woodlands and grazing areas, all shaped by centuries of human labour. The daily rhythm of peasant life. For a medieval peasant, the day began early, usually with the first light. In an age before artificial lighting was common or affordable, people generally synchronized their waking hours with daylight. This meant rising at dawn and retiring not long after sunset, with seasonal variations that might see summer workdays stretched to 16 hours, while winter days contracted to around 8. The first task of the morning was often tending to the fire, the heart of any medieval home. Unlike our modern stoves with their instant heat, the hearth fire was precious. It represented warmth, the ability to cook, and in many ways, survival itself. Letting it go out completely meant the difficult task of starting another from scratch, so most families banked their fires overnight, carefully preserving embers under ashes to be coaxed back to life in the morning. After a simple breakfast, perhaps some bread and ale or a porridge made from whatever grain was most abundant in the region, the day's labour began in earnest. The specific tasks varied enormously by season, but the constant was physical labour, performed mostly by hand or with the help of draft animals for those fortunate enough to own them. Spring brought the labour of ploughing and planting, with fields prepared using wooden ploughs, sometimes with iron ploughshares if the village blacksmith had access to this precious metal. Seeds were sown by hand, scattered across the freshly turned earth, in a process called broadcasting. Depending on the region, spring crops might include barley, oats, peas, beans, or vegetables for the household garden plot. Summer was a season of maintenance, weeding the growing crops, repairing tools and buildings in preparation for harvest, and carefully tending garden plots that provided vital dietary variety. It was also the time when sheep were sheared, providing wool that would be processed and spun during the less busy winter months. Fall centred around the all-important harvest, when entire communities worked together to bring in the crops before rain could spoil them. This was labour-intensive work done primarily with hand sickles, requiring people to bend for hours cutting grain stalks close to the ground. The harvested grain then needed threshing to separate kernels from stalks and winnowing to remove the chaff. The success or failure of this harvest would determine whether the community faced plenty or hunger in the coming year. Winter didn't bring rest as much as a shift in labour. This was the time for indoor work, repairing tools, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and performing household maintenance. It was also when most butchering occurred, as cold weather meant meat could be preserved longer, and keeping animals through winter required precious stored fodder. Throughout all seasons, women combined agricultural work with household management. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, brewing ale, making cheese, tending gardens, and countless other essential tasks that kept the family functioning. Children joined the workforce early, taking on age-appropriate tasks from around age 7. By their early teens, most children were working alongside adults, having learned their future roles through years of observation and increasingly responsible participation. The seasonal calendar, medieval peasant life, followed the rhythm of the seasons more intimately than most of us can imagine today. Without climate control, electric lights, or grocery stores stocked year-round with global produce, the changing seasons dictated nearly every aspect of daily existence. Let's walk through a year as a medieval peasant might have experienced it. The medieval year didn't begin on January 1st as ours does. For many, the year began at different times depending on local custom, often at Christmas, Easter, or Lady Day, March 25th. Regardless of when the calendar officially turned over, the real cycle began anew with the first stirrings of spring. As winter's grip loosened in February or March, depending on the region, preparations for spring planting began. The wooden plough was brought out, and if you were fortunate enough to own an ox or horse, it would be harnessed to help turn the soil. More commonly, humans provided much of the pulling power themselves, with family members working together to prepare the earth. March and April were planting months for spring crops. This was anxious work. Planting too early risked seeds rotting in cold, wet ground, while planting too late might mean crops wouldn't mature before full rains. Peasants relied on generations of local knowledge, weather signs, and the guidance of church festivals that roughly coincided with optimal planting times for their region. May brought the first breath of agricultural relief as winter stores began running dangerously low. Early vegetables from garden plots, wild greens from the waste, and milk from livestock that had recently given birth all helped bridge what historians call the hungry gap, that precarious time when last year's stores dwindled before the New Year's harvest. June saw continued field maintenance, haymaking for winter animal fodder, and the crucial task of protecting growing crops from birds, deer, and other hungry creatures. This was also when many communities held their summer festivals, often coinciding with Christian feasts, but containing elements of pre-Christian celebrations of the summer solstice. July and August brought the grain harvest, the most critical point in the agricultural year. Every able-bodied person participated, from the youngest children who could help gather sheaves to the oldest villagers who might sharpen tools or prepare meals for the workers. A good harvest meant survival. A poor one could mean hunger or worse. September continued the harvest season with fruits, nuts, and late vegetables. This was also when brewing occurred in many households, turning a portion of the precious grain harvest into ale, a daily beverage safer than often contaminated water sources. October was the time for slaughtering excess livestock that couldn't be fed through winter. This provided a rare abundance of meat that would be preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. Pigs were driven into forests to fatten on fallen acorns and beech nuts, a practice called pannage that made use of woodland resources. November saw the final preparations for winter. gathering the last fruits, nuts and firewood, repairing roofs and walls to withstand winter weather, and ensuring food storage was secure from dampness and vermin. December brought the shortest days and longest nights. Work turned inward to the household, repairing tools and clothing, spinning, weaving, and preserving the community bonds that were as essential to survival as material preparations. The Christmas season provided a welcome break from routine, with special foods saved for feast days and community celebrations that helped brighten the darkest time of year. January and February were often the hardest months, when stored food began running low and the promise of spring still seemed distant. These were months of careful rationing, indoor work by firelight, and perhaps storytelling to pass the long evenings and preserve cultural knowledge across generations. Throughout this cycle, the church calendar provided structure and meaning, with its feast days, fasts, and celebrations marking the passage of time. Saints' days served as practical calendrical markers. Planting might begin on St. Gregory's Day, haymaking around St. John's Day, or harvest near Lammas. This integration of religious observance and agricultural necessity reflected how thoroughly intertwined spiritual and practical concerns were in medieval peasant life. The social structure. Peasants and their lords. Medieval peasant life existed within a complex social structure that modern people often oversimplify. The famous three estates model, those who fight, nobility, those who pray, clergy, and those who work, peasantry, provides a starting point, but reality was considerably more nuanced. Among the peasantry itself, significant distinctions existed. At the top of the rural hierarchy were freeholders, peasants who owned their land outright and owed relatively minor obligations to their lords. Below them were various categories of tenants who held land in exchange for rent paid in labour, produce, or increasingly as the Middle Ages progressed, money. The majority of medieval peasants in many parts of Europe were serfs, a status that fell somewhere between freedom and slavery. Serfs were not owned as property in the way enslaved people were, but they were bound to the soil, meaning they couldn't legally leave their lord's land without permission. They inherited their status, passing their obligations from one generation to the next. These obligations could be substantial. A typical serf might owe their lord labour service, called week work, requiring them to work the lord's domain, the land directly managed by the lord, for several days each week, boon work, extra labour during critical times like harvest, various payments at significant life events such as a heriot, usually a family's best animal, paid when the head of a peasant household died, use fees for monopoly rights the lord controlled, such as requiring peasants to grind grain at the lord's mill and pay for the privilege the lord in turn had obligations toward peasants, providing protection, maintaining certain infrastructure, and administering justice through the manorial court. This relationship wasn't based on sentiment but necessity. Lords needed peasant labour to maintain their lifestyle and status, while peasants needed the protection and structure the lord provided in a frequently violent world. The manor court was central to this relationship. Here, local disputes were settled, regulations enforced, and the community's economic life organised. Records from these courts provide some of our richest insights into medieval peasant life. They show peasants weren't passive victims, but active participants who understood their rights under custom, and sometimes successfully defended them against lordly overreach. Women within this social structure had distinct legal standings that varied by region and period. Generally, peasant women had more economic involvement than their noble counterparts, working alongside men in many agricultural tasks while also managing households. Widows sometimes achieved significant independence, running holdings and even participating in manor courts. Children entered this social structure early, gradually taking on more responsibilities as they grew. By their early teens, most had assumed adult work roles, though they might remain within the parental household until marriage. The relationship between lords and peasants wasn't static throughout the Middle Ages. The catastrophic population decline following the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, reduced the labour supply, giving surviving peasants more bargaining power. This eventually contributed to the decline of serfdom in Western Europe, though the process was neither linear nor universal. The village community. While modern life often emphasises individuality and privacy, medieval peasant existence was thoroughly communal. The village wasn't just a collection of separate households, but an interdependent community whose survival depended on cooperation and mutual aid. This communal nature was physically embodied in the open field system. Without modern farming machinery, certain agricultural tasks required more labour than a single family could provide. Ploughing, harvesting, and threshing often became community affairs, with households working together sequentially across the village fields. This cooperation wasn't just practical but social, creating bonds through shared labour. Decision-making about agricultural matters was similarly communal. Villages had various forms of governance, often centred around assemblies of household heads who would decide when to plough, plant and harvest, which fields to leave fallow, and how to manage common resources like pastures and woodlands. While lords had overarching authority, much day-to-day agricultural management remained in peasant hands. The village church formed another centre of community life. Beyond religious services, the church building served as meeting place, refuge during danger, and ceremonial space for life's major transitions: baptism, marriage, and burial. Parish priests, often drawn from peasant backgrounds themselves, served as intermediaries between the village and the broader church hierarchy. Social regulation within the village was largely maintained through reputation and gossip. In small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, public opinion formed a powerful enforcement mechanism for behavioural norms. Behaviours that threatened community harmony or resources faced sanctions ranging from mockery to ostracism. Community was especially evident in times of hardship. When a family faced disaster, a fire, a death, crop failure, the village often mobilised to help. This wasn't pure altruism, but a recognition of mutual vulnerability. Anyone might need such help someday. The medieval peasant social safety net wasn't provided by the state, but by neighbours. Celebrations reinforced these community bonds. Harvest festivals, church holidays, and life events like weddings became occasions for the entire village to gather, share unusually abundant food and drink, and reaffirm their shared identity. These weren't frivolous diversions, but essential maintenance of the social fabric. Conflicts, of course, existed. Medieval court records show disputes over property boundaries, accusations of minor theft, slander, and occasional violence. Yet the remarkable aspect isn't that conflicts occurred, but how they were managed within a community that couldn't afford to banish or completely ostracize members whose labour remained necessary to collective survival. Food and diet. What did medieval peasants actually eat? Their diet was monotonous by modern standards, but not necessarily nutritionally poor when times were good. It varied considerably by region and season, but certain patterns held across much of Europe. The foundation of the medieval peasant diet was bread or grain porridge. The type of grain varied by region. Wheat and rye dominated in many parts of England and France, while oats were more common in Scotland and parts of northern Europe, and barley and millet appeared frequently in other regions. Wheat was generally considered superior, but was often reserved for sale rather than consumption by the peasants who grew it. Bread was a staple at nearly every meal, often accounting for 70 to 80% of caloric intake. Unlike our modern loaves, medieval peasant bread was typically dense, coarse, and made from minimally refined flour that retained much of the grain's bran. This made it more nutritious than later refined white breads, providing fibre and nutrients that modern processing removes. Accompanying this bread staple was a surprisingly varied assortment of foods, depending on season and location. Vegetables from garden plots, onions, garlic, leeks, cabbages, turnips, carrots, and beets were particularly important as they stored well through winter. Legumes like peas and beans, which provided crucial protein. Wild and cultivated fruits, consumed fresh in season and dried for winter. Nuts gathered from woodlands. Herbs, both for flavouring and medicinal purposes. Dairy products, particularly cheese and buttermilk, which preserved milk's nutrients in a form that could be stored eggs from chickens or other fowl meat. Eaten much less frequently than modern diets, but not as rarely as sometimes portrayed, meat consumption varied greatly by season and circumstance. Most peasant households kept at least a few animals, typically pigs, which could forage for themselves, or sheep valued for wool as much as meat. Chickens provided eggs year-round and meat occasionally. Beef was less common in the peasant diet, as cattle were valuable work animals and milk producers that few could afford to slaughter regularly. The full slaughtering season provided the most abundant meat, which was preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. Game supplemented this, though hunting rights were often restricted by lords. Nevertheless, small game, Rabbits, birds, and fish from streams and ponds added variety when available. The peasant diet followed strict seasonal patterns. Late summer and fall brought relative abundance, winter required careful rationing, and spring often saw stores dwindling dangerously, the so-called hungry gap, when last year's stores ran low before new crops matured. Beverages consisted primarily of ale or beer, often brewed with lower alcohol content than modern versions, water, though this could be dangerously contaminated, and occasionally wine in regions where grapes grew. Ale wasn't just consumed for its mild intoxicating effects, but because the brewing process made water safer to drink. Cooking methods were limited by technology and fuel constraints. Most homes centered around a single hearth fire where food was prepared in iron cauldrons or baked in communal ovens. Stewing and boiling were common techniques, as they required a little active tending and could transform tough ingredients into digestible meals. Fasting played an important role in the medieval diet. The church prohibited meat consumption on Fridays and during Lent, comprising nearly a third of the year. Far from being merely religious obligations, these fasts helped manage food supplies by reducing consumption of valuable protein sources during critical periods. During times of famine, the diet contracted drastically. People turned to famine foods, items normally considered unpalatable but that could sustain life, such as bark bread, flour extended with ground tree bark, various wild plants, and in extreme cases, items with minimal nutritional value consumed simply to ease hunger pangs. Housing and material culture. The image of the medieval peasant home we often carry, a quaint thatched cottage with whitewashed walls, contains elements of truth but oversimplifies a diverse reality that varied greatly by region, period, and the household's economic status. Throughout much of northern Europe, the typical peasant dwelling was indeed built with a wooden frame, but walls might be made of wattle and daub, a lattice of wooden strips filled with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes manure and animal hair, stacked stones, turf, or in timber-rich regions, wooden planks. In Mediterranean regions, stone construction was more common, while Eastern European peasants might live in partially subterranean dwellings that provided natural insulation. The interior space was typically a single room, though prosperous households might have simple divisions creating separate areas. At the centre stood the hearth, an open fire pit in earlier periods or a slightly raised hearth in later ones. Rarely did medieval peasant homes have chimneys. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or simply filtered through the thatch, which had the added benefit of helping to preserve it by deterring insects and fungus. Furniture was minimal by modern standards. Most households would have a table and perhaps benches for eating bedding that might consist of a wooden frame with rope supports covered by a straw-filled mattress for more prosperous families, or simple pallets on the floor for poorer ones, a chest for storing valuables and clothing, various hooks and shelves for hanging and storing tools, cooking implements, and foodstuffs. Windows, if they existed at all, were small and likely covered with oiled parchment or wooden shutters rather than glass, which remained prohibitively expensive for peasant homes until much later periods. Floors were typically packed earth covered with rushes or straw that absorbed spills and provided some insulation. These would be replaced periodically when they became too soiled, a practice that modern sensibilities might find unhygienic, but that served practical purposes in an era before modern flooring materials. The material possessions of a medieval peasant household were limited but precious. An inventory might include cooking equipment, an iron pot, perhaps a frying pan, wooden spoons, knives, eating vessels, wooden bowls, perhaps a few precious pottery items, agricultural tools, a ploughshare, hoe, scythe, sickle, flail for threshing, textile production tools, spindle, distaff, perhaps a loom, a few items of clothing, often homemade and mended repeatedly, religious items, perhaps a simple cross or a treasured prayer bead. These possessions represented significant investments of resources and labour. A cooking pot might represent the equivalent of weeks of work carefully maintained and passed down through generations. Tools were repaired rather than replaced, and everything was used until it was truly beyond repair, then repurposed into something else. Clothing was similarly precious and limited. The typical peasant might own only 2 or 3 sets of clothes, simple tunics and leggings for men, long dresses for women, with undergarments of linen if they could afford it. These would be made of wool or linen, as cotton remained rare and expensive in Europe until much later periods. Clothing was a significant investment, often handmade within the household, from fibre grown, processed, spun, and woven by family members. A single garment might represent months of part-time labour. Despite this material simplicity, medieval peasants were not without aesthetic sensibilities. Archaeological evidence reveals that even humble households sometimes contained decorated items, a carved wooden spoon, pottery with simple designs, or textile work with basic embroidery. Beauty wasn't considered a luxury but integrated into functional items through techniques that added little or no cost but considerable value to everyday life: health, illness, and medicine. For medieval peasants, health and illness operated within a framework quite different from our modern understanding of medicine. Their world combined practical herbal knowledge, religious explanations, and what we might now call folk remedies, creating a complex approach to maintaining health and addressing sickness. The medieval understanding of disease stemmed largely from the ancient Greek theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which needed to remain in balance for good health. Illness occurred when these humours became imbalanced, requiring interventions to restore proper equilibrium. While physicians serving the wealthy might apply this theory in sophisticated ways, peasants experienced a more practical, localized version, focused on observable symptoms and traditional remedies. Most healthcare in peasant communities happened at home, administered primarily by women who maintained knowledge of local medicinal plants and basic care techniques. A typical village might have a few individuals with special healing knowledge, a midwife, a bone setter, or someone skilled with herbs. But these weren't formal positions requiring certification as later medical practitioners would be. The herbal knowledge of medieval peasants was extensive and often effective. Gardens supplied not just food, but medicine, with plants like sage for sore throats and digestive issues, chamomile for inflammation and sleep problems, comfrey for wound healing, feverfew for headaches and fevers, yarrow to stop bleeding, garlic for infections, St. John's wort for melancholy and wound healing. These herbs were prepared as teas, poultices, salves, or tinctures, using techniques passed down through generations, often with surprising efficacy. Modern research has confirmed the medicinal properties of many traditional herbs, suggesting this knowledge wasn't merely superstition, but practical pharmacology developed through centuries of observation. Physical injuries received practical attention. Bone-setting techniques realigned broken bones before immobilizing them with wooden splints and bandages. Wounds were cleaned and bandaged, sometimes with honey or specific herbs known to prevent infection. Burns might be treated with aloe or cool water, followed by protective coverings. Childbirth occurred at home with assistance from experienced women, usually relatives or neighbours, and sometimes a dedicated midwife. While dangerous by modern standards, medieval midwifery incorporated significant practical knowledge about positioning, pain management, and handling common complications. The greatest dangers came from infections after birth and conditions we can now prevent or treat, like preeclampsia. Beyond these practical approaches, medieval medicine incorporated significant religious elements. Illness was sometimes seen as divine punishment, requiring spiritual intervention, alongside physical remedies. Saints were associated with healing particular conditions: St. Blie for throat ailments, St. Apollonia for toothaches, and prayers, pilgrimages, or offerings might supplement herbal treatments. The Church influenced medical care through monasteries, which preserved ancient medical texts and maintained infirmaries. However, most peasants would rarely, if ever, access this more formal care, relying instead on local knowledge and resources. Public health as we understand it didn't exist, but communities developed practical measures to manage disease. Villages might isolate those with contagious conditions, maintain water sources, and observe basic hygienic practices like separating human waste from living areas, even without understanding germ theory. When major epidemics struck, however, medieval communities had few effective defences. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351, killed perhaps a third of Europe's population precisely because neither the medical knowledge nor public health infrastructure existed to combat it effectively. Such catastrophic events reinforced the sense that serious illness reflected divine will rather than purely natural processes. Life expectancy for peasants was significantly lower than modern standards, but not as dismal as sometimes portrayed. Those surviving childhood, which posed the greatest risks, might reasonably expect to reach their 50s or 60s if they avoided famine, war, and epidemic disease. The stereotypical view of medieval peasants all dying young misrepresents a more complex reality, where many did live to what was considered old age, though often with chronic health problems we now treat effectively. Dental health presented particular challenges. Without modern dentistry, cavities and infections caused significant suffering. Practical remedies included clove oil for toothache, effectively containing a natural anaesthetic, and extraction for severely damaged teeth. The medieval diet, while containing less refined sugar than modern diets, still caused dental problems through abrasive flour that wore down tooth enamel and exposed nerves. Plagues, famines, and disasters. Perhaps no aspect of medieval life seems more alien to modern experience than the regularity with which peasant communities faced existential threats. While today's world certainly contains suffering, the apocalyptic scale and frequency of disasters in medieval Europe created a fundamentally different relationship with precarity and survival. Famine represented the most regular threat. In an agricultural system with limited technology, minimal fertilization beyond manure and fallowing, and no chemical pest control, crop failures occurred with grim regularity. A single bad harvest strained resources, consecutive failures could prove catastrophic. Even in good years, the period before harvest, particularly late spring and early summer, often brought food shortages as previous stores dwindled. The causes of medieval famines were numerous. Weather disruptions, unusually cold, wet growing seasons reduced yields dramatically, particularly during the Little Ice Age, roughly 1300 to 1850, plant diseases like ergot, which infected rye and caused both reduced yields and toxic effects when consumed, insect infestations that decimated growing crops or stored grain, human conflicts that destroyed fields or prevented normal cultivation, tax burdens that left insufficient food reserves. When famine struck, medieval communities had limited options. Some redistributed resources through church charity or manorial relief, but these systems easily became overwhelmed during widespread shortages. People turned to famine foods, items normally considered unpalatable, but that could sustain life, such as bark bread, nettles, or even boiled leather in extreme cases. Mortality rose not just from starvation, but from diseases that more easily affected weakened populations. The most notorious biological disaster of medieval Europe was undoubtedly the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, which killed an estimated 30 to 60% of the European population. This catastrophic pandemic, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread along trade routes from Asia, arriving in Europe through Mediterranean ports before moving inland. Without understanding of germ theory or effective quarantine methods, medieval populations had few defences against the plague. Various explanations emerged: divine punishment, poisoned wells, miasma, bad air, or astrological influences, leading to responses ranging from religious processions to the persecution of marginalized groups like Jews, who were tragically scapegoated in many communities. The Black Death wasn't a one-time event, but recurred periodically, with major outbreaks continuing into the 17th century. Each recurrence brought terror and disruption, though usually with lower mortality than the initial pandemic. These recurring epidemics became an expected feature of medieval life, shaping everything from inheritance practices to religious expression. Beyond plague, medieval peasants faced numerous other diseases that modern medicine now prevents or treats effectively. Smallpox, with its characteristic scarring among survivors, leprosy, which led to social ostracism and specialized isolation facilities, influenza, which periodically caused high mortality, especially among the elderly, typhus, particularly during times of warfare and displacement dysentery, and other waterborne illnesses that spread through contaminated water supplies, childhood diseases like measles, which caused significant mortality in non-immune populations. Natural disasters added another layer of vulnerability. Without modern construction standards, warning systems, or relief programs, events we might now consider manageable could devastate medieval communities. Floods destroyed crops, homes, and sometimes entire settlements built in floodplains. Fires spread rapidly through settlements constructed of flammable materials with minimal firefighting capability. Harsh winters killed livestock and depleted food stores. Droughts reduced crop yields and depleted water supplies. Human-caused disasters, particularly warfare, affected peasant communities with terrible regularity. Medieval conflicts might not reach the technological destructiveness of modern warfare, but they directly targeted peasant production through deliberate crop destruction, livestock theft, and the burning of villages. Even when peasants weren't directly attacked, armies passing through an area consumed resources, potentially leaving famine in their wake. The cumulative psychological impact of living with these recurrent threats created a worldview quite different from most modern experiences. Medieval peasants developed cultural and religious frameworks that acknowledged the precariousness of existence while providing explanatory models and coping mechanisms. Their resilience shouldn't be romanticized. It came at tremendous cost, but neither should it be underestimated. Religion and spirituality. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval peasant life, providing not just spiritual comfort, but a comprehensive framework for understanding the world and one's place in it. For most European peasants, this meant Christianity, though with significant regional variations and elements absorbed from pre-Christian traditions. The parish church stood as the physical centre of religious life. Unlike the grand cathedrals built in cities, village churches were typically modest structures, though still often the most substantial building in the community. Here, villagers gathered not just for Sunday Mass, but for the regular rhythm of religious observances that marked the days, seasons, and years of medieval life. These observances followed the liturgical calendar, which overlaid sacred meaning onto the agricultural year. Major feast days like Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days specific to the local church provided opportunities for celebration, while fasting periods like Lent and Advent imposed shared discipline and conserved resources during critical times. For many peasants, religious practice involved significant syncretism, the blending of official church teaching with folk beliefs and practices that sometimes had pre-Christian origins. The church often accommodated these traditions by repurposing them within Christian frameworks, such as associating previously sacred wells or stones with Christian saints, or incorporating traditional seasonal celebrations into Christian feast days. Saints played a particularly important role in peasant spirituality. Unlike the somewhat abstract concept of God, saints were approachable intercessors with specific areas of expertise. St. Isidore protected farmers, St. Barbara offered protection against lightning and sudden death, St. Anthony helped find lost items, and countless local saints addressed regional concerns. This created a spirituality that felt immediate and practical, offering spiritual solutions to everyday problems. Religious life extended beyond formal church services into daily practices. Simple prayers marked major activities like rising, eating, and retiring. Blessed objects like crosses, holy water, or saint medals provided tangible connections to divine protection. Pilgrimages to nearby shrines, or for the more ambitious major sites like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or even Jerusalem, represented significant spiritual journeys that combined devotion with rare opportunities for travel beyond one's immediate region. The church also provided crucial life cycle rituals: baptism shortly after birth, confirmation in early adolescence, marriage, and funeral rites. These sacraments marked major transitions and integrated individual lives into the broader Christian community across time and space. However, medieval peasant Christianity wasn't merely passive reception of church teaching. Historical records show vibrant debate, resistance to perceived clerical abuses, and active interpretation of religious concepts. Peasants might respect the office of priest while criticizing individual clergymen who failed to meet community standards, and they brought practical understandings to theological concepts that sometimes differed from official doctrine. Religious practice also included darker elements by modern standards. Fear of damnation was real and present, encouraged by dramatic church artwork depicting hell's torments and regular preaching on sin's consequences. The devil and demons weren't abstract concepts, but active presences believed to tempt and endanger souls, requiring constant vigilance. Alongside officially sanctioned practices existed what the church might consider superstition, but peasants saw as practical spiritual management. Charms against disease, rituals to ensure good harvests, or protective measures against supernatural threats. These practices reflected not opposition to Christianity, but its integration into a worldview where spiritual forces directly affected material conditions. By the later Middle Ages, lay religious movements gained increasing prominence, some within church structures and others challenging ecclesiastical authority. Groups like the Beguines and Beghards pursued intensely devotional lives outside traditional monastic frameworks, while movements like the Lollards in England questioned aspects of church hierarchy and practice, foreshadowing the later Protestant Reformation. The pervasiveness of religion in medieval peasant life shouldn't suggest unthinking conformity. Evidence shows a complex relationship where institutional religion provided essential structure and meaning while individuals and communities adapted teachings to their practical needs and understanding. This created a lived religion that was both deeply traditional and remarkably adaptable, helping communities navigate the considerable challenges of medieval existence. Work and labour. The medieval peasants' relationship with work differed fundamentally from modern conceptions of employment. Labour wasn't a separate category of life sold for wages, but an integrated component of existence, shaped by seasons, daylight, agricultural necessity, and communal obligations rather than clocks or contracts. Agricultural labour formed the foundation of medieval peasant work. This wasn't specialised production, but diverse activity requiring knowledge of soils, crops, weather patterns, and animal husbandry. A successful peasant farmer needed to understand when to plant different crops based on local conditions, how to maintain appropriate crop rotations to preserve soil fertility, which animals suited local environments and resources, how to manage common lands collectively with neighbours, when and how to harvest for maximum yield and minimal spoilage. The specific agricultural tasks varied enormously by region and crop. Grain cultivation, the mainstay of most European agriculture, involved ploughing, initially with wooden ploughs, later with iron-tipped versions, sowing, broadcasting seeds by hand, weeding throughout the growing season, harvesting with sickles, binding cut grain into sheaves, threshing to separate grain from chaff, and winnowing to remove husks. Each of these tasks required specific skills and tools. Ploughing, for instance, demanded strength and skill to maintain straight furrows at consistent depth. Harvesting required practiced technique to cut grain efficiently without strain or injury over long hours. Threshing demanded rhythmic coordination to strike grain repeatedly without damaging the kernels. These weren't unskilled tasks, but complex activities requiring years to master. Beyond grain cultivation, medieval peasants typically maintained kitchen gardens with vegetables, herbs, and possibly fruit trees. These plots received intensive care, regular watering, careful weeding, and protection from pests, providing crucial dietary diversity beyond staple grains. Women often held primary responsibility for these garden plots, integrating this work with other household tasks. Animal husbandry constituted another major work category. Livestock provided multiple resources: wool from sheep, milk from cows or goats, eggs from chickens, meat from various animals, and crucial labour from oxen or horses. Each species required specific knowledge of feeding, breeding, birthing, and disease management. Animals needed daily attention regardless of seasonal weather, creating constant work that couldn't be postponed. Textile production represented a significant labour commitment, particularly for women. The process from raw fibre to finished cloth involved multiple specialised tasks: cleaning and preparing wool or flax carding, or combing fibres to align them, spinning fibre into thread using drop spindles, or later, spinning wheels, weaving thread into cloth on looms, finishing cloth through fulling, dyeing, or other treatments. These textile tasks often filled otherwise idle moments, with women spinning while walking, watching children, or during evening gatherings. This constant productive activity maximised limited daylight and available labour, converting small time increments into essential household goods. Woodworking, metalworking, and other crafts occupied some peasants, either as primary occupations in more specialised communities, or as secondary skills in primarily agricultural settings. A typical village might have households specialising in blacksmithing, carpentry, milling, or brewing, creating a local exchange economy alongside agricultural production. For most peasants, labour obligations to lords formed another work category. These could include week work on the lord's domain fields, typically several days weekly, boon work during critical periods like harvest, when additional labour was required, maintenance of roads, bridges, or other infrastructure processing agricultural products like grinding grain or pressing grapes, construction, or repair of manorial buildings. These obligations varied enormously across regions and periods. Following events like the Black Death, which created labour shortages, many labour services were commuted to cash payments as peasants gained bargaining power, and lords needed currency for emerging market economies. Women's work in medieval peasant communities was both productive and reproductive. Beyond childbearing and rearing, substantial labour in pre-modern conditions, women typically participated in agricultural fieldwork, managed garden plots, processed food for storage, produced textiles, prepared meals, maintained the home, gathered resources like firewood and water, and managed smaller livestock. This work often received less formal recognition than men's labour, but was equally essential to household survival. Children joined the workforce gradually, taking on age-appropriate tasks from early ages. Young children might scare birds from fields, collect eggs, or gather firewood, while older children assumed increasingly adult responsibilities. By their early teens, most children worked essentially as adults, having acquired skills through years of observation and incremental participation. The medieval peasant workday followed natural rhythms rather than clock time. Work began at dawn and continued until dusk, with meal breaks providing rest periods. The workday stretched significantly longer during summer months and contracted during winter, creating seasonal variations in labour patterns. This meant summer workdays might extend to 16 hours, while winter days comprised perhaps 8 hours of productive labour. Religious calendars also shaped work patterns. Sundays and various feast days prohibited certain work types, creating perhaps 100 to 150 non-working days annually. However, essential tasks like animal care continued even on these days, and the prohibition mainly affected field labour rather than domestic work. These religious breaks provided necessary rest while structuring the agricultural year around significant seasonal transitions. The medieval approach to work involved little separation between labour and life. Work happened in and around the home, incorporated social elements as community members worked together, and followed natural cycles rather than artificial schedules. While undeniably demanding, this integration meant work contained social and seasonal variety that industrialized labour would later eliminate through standardization and specialization. Trade, markets, and economy. When imagining medieval peasant life, we often picture isolated, self-sufficient villages disconnected from broader economic networks. The reality was considerably more complex and connected, with peasants participating in diverse economic activities that linked local production to regional and sometimes international trade networks. Most peasant households aim for partial self-sufficiency in essential goods, growing much of their food, producing basic textiles, and crafting simple tools. However, complete self-sufficiency was neither practical nor desired. Even modest households participated in various economic exchanges, local markets where surplus produce might be sold or bartered. Specialized craft goods purchased from village artisans required payments to lords and church, increasingly monetized as the Middle Ages progressed. Occasional major purchases like livestock, metalware, or special textiles. Village markets provided the primary connection between peasant production and wider networks. Depending on region and period, these might operate weekly in larger villages or more occasionally in smaller settlements. Here, peasants could sell surplus production, eggs, cheese, vegetables, textiles, or other goods, to neighbours or travelling merchants. These small-scale exchanges created critical opportunities to acquire items they couldn't produce and to obtain currency for taxes and fees. Currency itself had a complex relationship with peasant economics. Early medieval peasants operated primarily in a non-cash economy, with obligations to lords paid in labour or agricultural products. As the Middle Ages progressed, these arrangements increasingly commuted to cash payments, requiring peasants to sell products specifically to obtain currency. By the later medieval period, even modest households needed regular access to coinage for various obligations. Regional markets in larger towns expanded economic opportunities. Travelling to these less frequent but larger gatherings, peasants could access broader networks, selling products to urban consumers or merchants who might transport goods farther afield. These market trips represented significant events, opportunities to acquire specialised goods, hear news, and connect with the world beyond the village. The items peasants sought through market exchange varied by household resources and necessity. Salt, essential for food preservation, and typically not locally available metal tools, requiring specialised production beyond village capabilities. Millstones, necessary for grinding grain but requiring specific stone types, specialized textiles like silk or finely woven wool for special occasions, spices, primarily for food preservation rather than flavoring religious items like candles, rosaries, or devotional images. These market connections integrated even remote villages into broader economic systems. A peasant might never travel more than 20 miles from home, yet participate in networks extending across continents. The wool from their sheep could eventually reach Italian cloth producers, while the salt they purchased might come from mines hundreds of miles distant. Peasant participation in these networks varied significantly by geographic location. Villages near transportation routes or urban centres had greater market access, household resources. Wealthier peasants engaged more extensively in market activities. Regional specialisation, areas focused on wine, wool or other export products had stronger market orientation. Historical period, market integration generally increased throughout the medieval period. This market participation shouldn't suggest that medieval peasants operated in anything resembling a modern capitalist economy. Economic activity remained embedded in social relationships and moral frameworks that modern market economies would later separate. Prices often reflected customary values rather than pure supply and demand, while community welfare sometimes took precedence over profit maximization. The church significantly influenced economic activity through prohibitions against usury, charging interest, promotion of just price concepts, and establishment of market regulations. Religious calendars determined market days, typically coinciding with saints' days, or after Sunday services when people already gathered, creating a natural integration of commercial, social, and spiritual activities. Lords also shaped local economies through various monopoly rights. Many lords controlled essential processing facilities like mills, ovens, or wine presses, requiring peasants to pay for their use rather than creating competing facilities. These banalities generated significant income for lords while adding another economic burden to peasant households. Towns and emerging urban centres created new economic relationships for nearby rural communities. As urban populations grew increasingly disconnected from agricultural production, they created reliable markets for peasant products. This relationship intensified after the Black Death reduced population while increasing per capita wealth among survivors, creating expanded markets for specialized agricultural goods like dairy products, vegetables, and fruits beyond staple grains. By the later Middle Ages, specialized commercial agriculture began emerging in regions with good urban access or transportation connections. Some peasant communities shifted toward products specifically destined for market rather than local consumption. Vineyards in suitable regions, vegetable production near cities, or livestock raising where conditions favoured it. This specialisation created new opportunities, but also new vulnerabilities when markets fluctuated. The medieval peasant economy was thus neither completely self-sufficient nor fully market-oriented, but a complex blend that varied enormously across time, space, and social position. This economic flexibility, maintaining basic self-sufficiency while engaging with broader networks when advantageous, formed a crucial adaptive strategy for navigating the uncertainties of medieval life, family life and gender roles. At the heart of medieval peasant society stood the family unit, not just a social arrangement, but the fundamental economic, educational and welfare institution through which individuals navigated life. Understanding medieval peasant families requires setting aside modern assumptions about childhood, marriage, gender, and aging to appreciate how these relationships functioned within their historical context. The typical medieval peasant household centered around a nuclear family, parents, and their children, though extended family members might join the household in various circumstances. Multiple generations commonly lived together, not necessarily from preference but from economic necessity and practical care arrangements. Elderly parents might remain in the household, contributing what labour they could while receiving care as their abilities declined. Marriage formed the foundation of new peasant households, typically occurring in the late teens or 20s, rather than the very young marriages sometimes associated with medieval nobility. For peasants, marriage represented not just personal partnership, but an economic alliance, forming a new productive unit within the village economy. The practical nature of peasant marriage doesn't mean affection was absent. Court records and literature suggest many medieval marriages involved genuine attachment alongside economic partnership. However, compatibility for labour was often as important as personal feeling, with communities and families carefully evaluating potential matches for their productive potential. Marriage typically required sufficient resources to establish a viable household, often delaying marriage until inheritance or savings permitted independent living community and family approval, as marriages affected not just individuals but social networks. Church blessing. Though formal church ceremonies became standardized only gradually throughout the medieval period, once established, peasant marriages created partnerships with distinct yet complementary gender roles. Men typically handled ploughing, heavy field work, woodland management, and represented the household in manorial courts or village assemblies. Women managed the household, garden plots, dairy production, textile work, food processing and childcare, while also participating in field labour during crucial periods like harvest. These gender divisions weren't absolute but practical adaptations to biological realities, particularly women's childbearing role and social expectations. Widows and widowers necessarily took on cross-gender tasks when partnerships dissolved through death, demonstrating that these roles reflected social organisation more than inherent capabilities. Childbearing and rearing formed a central aspect of women's lives, with fertility both personally and communally valued. Large families provided necessary labour and potential security in old age, though high infant and child mortality meant many children never reached adulthood. A woman might bear 8 to 10 children, but see only 3 to 4 survive to maturity, creating family relationships marked by both regular loss and strong attachment. Childhood in medieval peasant communities differed significantly from modern conceptions. Children were valued members of society and families, but childhood wasn't the protected, education-focused period we now expect. Instead, young children remained close to mothers or older siblings, participating in household activities from early ages. By around age 7, children began taking on meaningful work responsibilities appropriate to their strength and abilities. Adolescents worked essentially as adults while learning increasingly complex skills through participation rather than formal instruction. Education focused on practical knowledge and moral, religious understanding rather than literacy for most. This approach to childhood reflected economic necessity rather than neglect. Every household needed all available labour, and children's gradual integration into work roles provided essential education for their future survival. Play still existed, often incorporating elements that developed skills needed for adult work, while creating the social bonds that would sustain community relationships. Older adults maintained important roles within peasant families as repositories of knowledge and experienced workers whose skills compensated for declining physical strength. While aging certainly brought physical challenges in a labour-intensive society without modern medical interventions, the elderly weren't typically marginalised, but remained integrated in household and community activities appropriate to their abilities. Extended kinship networks provided crucial safety nets beyond the immediate household. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and more distant relations created webs of mutual obligation and potential assistance during crises. These relationships were actively maintained through shared celebrations, labour exchange, and regular social contact, creating resilient support systems when individual households faced challenges beyond their resources. Inheritance practices varied regionally, but typically aimed to maintain viable agricultural units while providing for all children. In some regions, land might be divided equally among heirs, creating ever smaller holdings over generations. Elsewhere, primogeniture, inheritance by the eldest son, or ultimogeniture, inheritance by the youngest, kept land holdings intact while requiring alternative provisions for non-inheriting children. These family structures and practices weren't static throughout the medieval period. The demographic catastrophe of the Black Death particularly transformed family patterns by creating labour shortages that increased wages, reduced availability of marriage partners, and allowed earlier household formation as land became more available. Later medieval families typically enjoyed improved material conditions compared to their pre-plague predecessors, though with significant regional variation. Knowledge and education. When we think of medieval education, we often imagine monasteries with monks copying manuscripts or cathedral schools teaching Latin grammar. While these formal educational institutions existed, they remained inaccessible to the vast majority of peasants. However, this doesn't mean medieval peasant communities lacked sophisticated knowledge systems or educational practices. They simply operated differently from formal literacy-based education. Medieval peasant education happened primarily through apprenticeship within the family and community. Children learned by doing, gradually assuming more complex tasks under adult supervision. This educational approach effectively transmitted the diverse knowledge required for agricultural success, understanding soils, weather patterns, animal behavior, plant growth cycles, food preservation, tool maintenance, and countless other skills necessary for survival. This knowledge wasn't simplistic or easily acquired. A successful farmer needed to recognize dozens of plant varieties, including both crops and weeds, understand the specific needs of different soil types, predict weather patterns through careful observation of natural indicators, diagnose and treat common animal ailments, maintain complex tools with limited resources, process and preserve foods through various techniques. Similarly, household management required extensive knowledge of food storage and preservation methods for different products, textile production from raw materials to finished cloth, medicinal properties of local plants, fire management for cooking, heating, and specialized tasks like brewing, child development, and basic healthcare. These knowledge systems developed over generations through careful observation and collective experience. When modern scientists have studied traditional agricultural practices, they've often discovered sophisticated ecological understanding embedded in what outsiders might dismiss as mere custom or superstition. Crop rotations, companion planting, and sustainable harvesting practices all reflected genuine ecological knowledge developed through centuries of observation. Knowledge transmission happened through multiple channels. Direct instruction, as adults explained and demonstrated tasks. Supervised practice with gradual increases in responsibility. Oral tradition, including stories, proverbs, and songs that encoded practical information. Seasonal rituals that reinforced agricultural knowledge through community participation, observation of skilled practitioners. While formal literacy remained rare among peasants throughout most of the medieval period, oral culture transmitted enormous amounts of information. Stories weren't merely entertainment, but vehicles for practical knowledge, moral instruction, community history, and cultural values. Proverbs condensed generational wisdom into memorable forms, while songs often contained practical information about agricultural timing, weather prediction, or technical processes. Some specialized knowledge holders maintained particularly important roles in peasant communities. Midwives possessed crucial understanding of childbirth and women's health. Blacksmiths maintained metallurgical knowledge essential for tool production, and certain elders might specialize in weather prediction, animal healing, or other valuable skills. These knowledge specialists often enjoyed enhanced status and might travel between communities sharing their expertise. Religious education formed another knowledge domain. Parish priests provided basic Christian instruction, with children learning essential prayers, biblical stories, and church practices. This religious knowledge wasn't separate from practical matters, but integrated into the agricultural calendar through saints' days that marked seasonal transitions and appropriate activities. Formal literacy slowly increased throughout the medieval period, particularly in later centuries and in regions with commercial development, requiring written records. By the later Middle Ages, some peasant communities had parish schools providing basic literacy, usually to boys from more prosperous families who might need reading and calculation skills for commercial activities or local administrative roles. The knowledge systems of medieval peasants were neither static nor isolated. Innovation occurred, albeit slowly by modern standards, through adaptation of techniques from neighboring regions, experimentation with new crops or methods, response to environmental changes requiring modified approaches, integration of new technologies like improved plough designs or crop varieties. This capacity for innovation challenges stereotypes of medieval peasants as mindlessly traditional. When new approaches offered genuine advantages without unacceptable risks, communities could adapt their practices. However, in an environment where failure might mean starvation, innovation necessarily proceeded cautiously, with changes tested incrementally before wider adoption. The medieval peasant approach to knowledge valued practical application over theoretical understanding. Things worked because experience showed they worked, not because underlying principles were understood in terms recognizable to modern science. This pragmatic approach created robust knowledge systems that effectively managed local environments, despite lacking the systematization of later scientific thinking. Entertainment and leisure. The modern distinction between work and leisure would have seemed foreign to medieval peasants. Their lives integrated labour and recreation in ways that reflected both practical necessity and cultural values, quite different from our compartmentalised approach to time and activity. This doesn't mean medieval peasants lacked entertainment or never enjoyed themselves. Despite demanding work lives, they created and maintained rich cultural traditions that provided both enjoyment and community cohesion. These leisure activities, however, often connected to practical purposes or religious observances rather than existing as separate recreational categories. The church calendar provided the framework for much medieval entertainment, with numerous feast days creating opportunities for celebration. Major festivals like Christmas, Easter, Midsummer, and harvest celebrations allowed communities to gather for eating, drinking, dancing, and various games. These weren't simply breaks from work, but important community-building events that reinforced social bonds essential for collective survival. Music pervaded peasant life, not as separate performance but integrated into daily activities. Work songs rhythmically coordinated group labour like threshing or rowing, making tasks more efficient while reducing their tedium. Lullabies soothed children, ballads preserved historical and cultural knowledge, and dance music accompanied celebrations. These musical traditions relied primarily on voice, with instrumental accompaniment from accessible instruments like pipes, drums, or stringed instruments constructed from locally available materials. Storytelling occupied central importance in evening entertainment, particularly during winter when darkness limited outdoor work. Gathered around the hearth, community members shared folk tales, local histories, saints' legends, and family stories. These narratives weren't merely entertainment, but vehicles for transmitting practical knowledge, moral instruction, community values, and cultural identity across generations. Games provided both enjoyment and skill development. Children's games often mimicked adult tasks, building physical abilities and social skills needed for later life. Adult games included various board games similar to chess, checkers, or backgammon, often played on boards scratched into surfaces rather than as elaborate equipment. Dice games, though these faced periodic church disapproval due to gambling associations, physical contests demonstrating strength, speed, or skill. Seasonal team competitions between neighbouring villages or parish sections. Alcohol played a significant role in medieval socialising, with ale or beer, depending on region, consumed daily by all age groups. Unlike modern high-alcohol beverages, everyday medieval ales typically had lower alcohol content while providing crucial calories and safer hydration than potentially contaminated water sources. Special brews with higher alcohol content marked celebrations and feast days, creating distinct festive beverages for important occasions. Seasonal celebrations followed the agricultural and religious calendar, with particular significance attached to midwinter festivities, later incorporated into Christmas, marking the darkest days and anticipating returning light spring celebrations associated with Easter, recognizing new growth and agricultural beginnings, midsummer festivities celebrating maximum daylight and growing crops, harvest celebrations expressing gratitude for successful crops and community cooperation. These celebrations often incorporated elements from pre-Christian traditions alongside Christian observances, creating syncretic practices that served both spiritual and social purposes. Activities might include processions through fields or village boundaries, special foods reserved for particular celebrations, bonfires, especially at midwinter and midsummer, Morris dancing and other traditional dance forms, seasonal plays or pageants, some depicting religious stories and others addressing agricultural or community themes. Life cycle celebrations provided another form of communal entertainment. Weddings particularly offered opportunities for extended festivities, with dancing, feasting, and various traditional customs specific to local regions. While limited by resources compared to noble celebrations, peasant weddings still represented significant community events, where relative abundance was displayed through food, drink, and hospitality appropriate to the family's means. Fairs combined economic and entertainment functions, creating temporary gathering spaces where commerce, socializing, and various amusements coexisted. Traveling performers might appear at larger fairs. Musicians, storytellers, jugglers, or simple theatrical troupes, providing exposure to broader cultural traditions beyond the village. These fairs created rare opportunities to experience novelty in lives otherwise defined by familiar routines and faces. The physical environment itself provided leisure spaces, particularly for children. Streams became swimming holes in summer, hills became sledding slopes in winter, and forests offered spaces for exploration and play. These activities weren't separated from practical purposes. Children swimming might also check fish traps, while forest exploration taught valuable knowledge about edible plants or animal behaviors. Despite these various entertainments, modern observers would likely find medieval peasant leisure limited by contemporary standards. Entertainment remained largely participatory, rather than passive, locally produced rather than imported, and integrated with practical or spiritual purposes rather than existing solely for amusement. Free time itself was seasonally variable rather than regularly scheduled, with winter evenings offering more leisure while harvest periods required nearly constant labour. Politics and governance. When we think of medieval politics, grand images often come to mind. Kings in castles, knights on crusades, bishops in cathedrals. Yet governance affected peasant lives in immediate and practical ways through systems operating at multiple levels, from the manor to the kingdom and church hierarchy. Understanding how peasants navigated these structures reveals not passive victims, but active participants within their political constraints. The manor formed the most immediate governance structure for many peasants. This administrative unit centered around a lord's estate, and the peasant communities tied to it through various obligations. Manorial courts served as the primary interface between peasants and formal authority, handling matters including regulation of agricultural practices, settlement of local disputes, enforcement of labour obligations, collection of various fees and fines, transfer of land rights between peasants, punishment for minor offences. These courts weren't simply impositions of lordly will, but operated according to local custom, with peasants themselves often serving as jurors and participating in decision-making within established parameters. Court records reveal peasants actively using these systems to protect their interests, resolve conflicts and maintain community standards. Village governance operated alongside and sometimes independently from manorial structures. Most villages had some form of self-government handling matters like regulation of common resources such as pastures, woodlands and water sources, organisation of collective labour for maintenance of paths, bridges or drainage systems, management of agricultural coordination like planting and harvest timing, enforcement of community behavioural standards. This governance might operate through formal village councils, assemblies of household heads, or recognition of respected elders' authority. While not democratic in the modern sense, these systems typically involved significant community input, adapted to local conditions and needs. Parish structures provided another governance layer, addressing both religious and community needs. The parish church served as meeting place, information centre, and administrative hub. Church wardens, typically respected peasants elected by the community, managed church property and finances while representing parish interests to higher church authorities. Beyond these local structures, peasants existed within broader regional and royal governance systems. The extent to which these higher authorities directly affected daily life varied enormously, depending on geographic location and accessibility, historical period, and prevailing political systems, local lords' relationship with higher authorities, regional political stability. Most peasants experienced royal authority primarily through taxation, military obligations, and legal systems that overlapped with local governance. Royal officials periodically appeared to collect taxes, recruit for military service, or investigate serious crimes beyond manorial court jurisdiction. These interactions were often unwelcome, but represented the practical reality of existing within larger political structures. The church hierarchy similarly affected peasant communities through tithe collection, typically 10% of agricultural production, implementation of canon law regarding marriage, sexual behaviour, and religious practices, periodic visitations by church officials to ensure proper religious observance, provision of services like education, poor relief, and healthcare through monastic institutions. Medieval peasants weren't passive recipients of governance, but engaged actively within available channels. Historical records show numerous examples of peasant communities, bringing complaints against lords who violated customary rights, negotiating collectively for improved conditions, particularly after the Black Death created labour shortages, using legal systems to protect community resources, sending representatives to petition higher authorities when local remedies failed, occasionally resorting to direct resistance or revolt when other methods failed. The most dramatic examples of peasant political action were the various revolts that periodically erupted across medieval Europe. These weren't spontaneous outbursts of irrational violence, but organised responses to specific grievances, often reflecting sophisticated political understanding. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the Jacquerie in France, 1358, and similar uprisings typically emerged when customary rights were violated or new impositions threatened established livelihoods. These rebellions rarely succeeded long-term, lacking the resources and political connections to overcome entrenched power, but they demonstrated peasants' political awareness and willingness to act collectively when pushed beyond tolerable limits. Even failed revolts sometimes achieved partial concessions, or temporarily halted particularly oppressive practices. More commonly, peasant communities exercised political agency through less dramatic means: daily negotiations, strategic use of existing legal systems, development of mutual aid networks beyond official governance, and maintenance of community solidarity against external pressures. These approaches relied on intimate knowledge of local power structures and customary rights that could be leveraged for community benefit. Women's relationship with governance structures was generally more limited than men's, with household heads, typically male, representing family interests in formal settings. However, court records show women actively participating in manorial courts in specific circumstances, particularly as witnesses in matters affecting their specific work domains, or as widows managing households. Women also exercise significant informal influence through kinship networks and community relationships that shaped local governance despite their limited formal authority. Political consciousness among peasants shouldn't be understood in modern ideological terms, but as practical knowledge of rights, obligations, and effective navigation of power relationships. This consciousness included sophisticated understanding of customary law, strategic assessment of when to comply and when to resist, and recognition of collective action's power within specific contexts. Medieval peasants weren't proto-revolutionaries, but neither were they politically naive. They were pragmatic actors within systems they hadn't chosen, but had learned to navigate for survival and occasional advantage. The end of the medieval peasantry. The medieval peasantry didn't disappear overnight, but gradually transformed through interconnected economic, social, and political changes that accelerated in the later Middle Ages and early modern period. This transformation varied enormously by region, with some areas maintaining essentially medieval structures well into the 18th century, while others changed rapidly from the 15th century onward. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351, and subsequent plague recurrences created the first major disruption to traditional peasant life. The catastrophic population decline, perhaps 30 to 60% across Europe, fundamentally altered the relationship between land and labour. With fewer workers available, surviving peasants gained unprecedented bargaining power, leading to rising wages for agricultural labour, declining rents as lords competed for tenants, commutation of labour services to cash payments, increased social mobility as labour shortages created opportunities, greater access to land as previously cultivated areas became available. These changes benefited many surviving peasants materially, while weakening traditional manorial structures. Lords increasingly shifted from direct management of domain lands through peasant labour obligations to leasing these lands to tenant farmers for cash rents, fundamentally altering the economic relationship. The growth of commerce and urban markets created new economic opportunities beyond traditional agricultural production. Regions with good transportation access increasingly shifted toward commercial agriculture, producing specific crops or products for market rather than local consumption. This commercialization created both opportunities and vulnerabilities, as peasant producers became more integrated into broader economic networks, subject to price fluctuations beyond local control. Legal changes gradually transformed peasant status across Europe, though with significant regional variation. Western Europe generally saw earlier decline of serfdom. In England, serfdom had largely disappeared by the early 16th century. In France, Legal serfdom persisted in some regions until the French Revolution, but had been significantly modified earlier. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, various forms of unfree status continued longer, but with gradual modifications, Eastern Europe experienced a different pattern, with what historians call the Second Serfdom actually intensifying restrictions on peasants from the 16th century onward as landowners supplied grain to Western European markets. This regional divergence highlights how economic opportunities could either improve or worsen peasant conditions depending on how they affected power relationships. Technological changes gradually transformed agricultural production. Improved plough designs, new crop rotations, selective breeding of livestock and other innovations increased productivity while changing labour requirements. These changes generally emerge incrementally from peasant practice, rather than being imposed from outside until later periods. The emergence of centralised states increasingly bypassed traditional manorial structures, creating direct relationships between royal authority and peasant communities through taxation, legal systems, and eventually military conscription. This development had mixed effects, sometimes protecting peasants from local exploitation, while imposing new burdens through more efficient state extraction of resources. Religious transformations, particularly the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation, affected peasant communities by altering or eliminating traditional religious practices integrated into agricultural life, changing patterns of charitable support, creating new educational opportunities through emphasis on Bible reading in Protestant areas, sometimes appropriating church lands that had previously been leased to peasant producers. Enclosure movements, beginning in some regions during the late medieval period but accelerating later, fundamentally transformed land access by converting common lands and open field systems to privately controlled, enclosed properties. This process disproportionately benefited wealthier landholders while eliminating crucial resources for poorer peasants who relied on common rights for grazing, gathering, and subsistence agriculture. Population recovery and growth from the 16th century onward gradually reversed the post-plague labour advantage, creating new pressures on land access and driving down wages. This demographic shift contributed to increasing stratification within rural communities, with growing numbers of landless or land-poor agricultural workers, alongside more prosperous peasant producers. New World crops, particularly potatoes and maize, transformed agricultural possibilities in many regions, allowing cultivation of previously marginal lands and significantly increasing caloric production per acre. These innovations supported population growth, while changing dietary patterns and agricultural practices in regions where they were adopted. Across these various changes, the medieval peasant gradually transformed into recognisably modern, rural categories: commercial farmers, agricultural labourers, rural artisans and others, though the transition occurred at dramatically different rates across Europe. By the 18th century, few European agricultural producers lived in genuinely medieval conditions, though many aspects of traditional practice and community structure persisted within new economic frameworks. This transition shouldn't be viewed simplistically as either progress or decline. For some rural inhabitants, the end of medieval structures brought increased prosperity, autonomy, and opportunity. For others, particularly those with marginal land access, the dissolution of traditional community supports and common rights created new vulnerabilities. The peasantry's transformation reflected broader reorganization of European society rather than simple improvement or deterioration of rural conditions. Legacy of medieval peasantry. The world of the medieval peasant may seem impossibly distant from our modern experience, yet its legacy persists in visible and invisible ways that continue shaping our present. Understanding this legacy helps us appreciate how these seemingly remote ancestors contributed to the world we inhabit today. The physical landscape itself bears the imprint of medieval peasant labour. Across much of Europe, field patterns, village locations, road networks, and woodland distributions still reflect medieval arrangements. Even in regions transformed by later industrial development or modern agriculture, archaeological evidence reveals how thoroughly medieval communities shaped their environments through centuries of cultivation, drainage, and resource management. Agricultural knowledge developed by medieval peasants through generations of practical experience formed the foundation for later innovations. Many crop rotations, soil management techniques, and sustainable practices now receiving renewed attention emerge from medieval peasant experimentation, rather than formal scientific research. This practical ecological knowledge represented a sophisticated understanding of local environments, developed through careful observation and collective experience. Cultural traditions maintaining connections to medieval origins persist in folk music, dances, festivals and foodways across Europe and regions influenced by European settlement. While continuously evolving rather than frozen in time, these traditions preserve elements of how medieval communities celebrated, mourned, worked together, and marked seasonal transitions. Many European languages retain vocabulary, expressions, and proverbs originating in medieval agricultural contexts. These linguistic fossils preserve conceptual frameworks and practical wisdom from peasant experience. References to ploughing, harvesting, animal husbandry, and weather patterns that entered common vocabulary and remain there despite the activity's declining relevance to most modern speakers. Religious practices continue reflecting medieval synthesis of formal doctrine with local traditions and agricultural concerns. Saints' days, harvest festivals, and seasonal celebrations maintain connections to medieval religious calendars that integrated spiritual and agricultural life. Even as formal religious participation declines in many European regions, these traditional observances often persist as cultural heritage. Settlement patterns established in the medieval period continue influencing modern housing and community arrangements. The distribution of villages, the relationship between settlements and resources, and even street layouts in medieval origin towns reflect decisions made by peasant communities centuries ago for reasons still relevant: access to water, defensible positions, fertile land, or transportation routes.